I'm Ed. As you just heard, one of the problems is Richard just took all my material because I'm sort of talking on the same topic, and like he said, he's pushing me to the edge. So we're going to look at just a very slice of this topic of globalization. And the question, I looked at it as a personal challenge because I saw the list of questions. And the question was, do we have room for disappearing cultures? And I decided that was one I wanted to take a shot at. And I have to admit, I'm not an expert in this. I'm just an observer, hopefully a little bit less than casual observer, but just an observer. And I also have to admit, I don't have the answer. But I'm going to explore some of the conflicts that I think we see with this very, very interesting topic. So first of all, you have to understand where I'm coming from. I've been in Bangkok since 1992, and I really came from the private sector. I've started a number of businesses, and that got me into teaching entrepreneurship. And I've always had this interest in technology. I was an engineer from MIT, and I always grew up believing technology could solve all the problems of the world. Certainly believed an engineer could solve all the problems of the world. So this was the background I have. And probably the most important thing for our discussion today is I like to drive. So this takes me around the region. This is actually up in northeastern Cambodia, or down in northeastern Cambodia from here. And I have a chance to see different parts of Asia outside the cities, sometimes very far outside the cities. And what's interesting when you go to a place like this, there's two interesting things about this road that I'm on here. One is, as you can tell by the picture, it's a very remote area. One thing you cannot tell about the picture is it is part of what will someday be, if the United Nations and the Asia Development Bank have their way, something called the Asia Highway Network. This is actually a road that's designated to be an Asian highway. So if they have their way, someday there'll be a multi-lane highway running down this dirt road. And I think that's an interesting conflict. Part of me likes to be here before the highway is built, and part of me likes to be here in a place where there is incredible progress being planned. So these are the things I like to think about. I am a big believer in entrepreneurship and that it can be a positive change, and we saw a whole bunch of examples in the previous presentation, and I know we'll see a lot more today. And I also hope that technology can be a driver for social change or environmental change. And because of my driving around, I'm always thinking particularly about Southeast Asia, but the general question of how might development happen in a positive way? Because there's a lot of, when we use the G word, globalization, it can be a very emotional word, and it can lead people in different ideas about what's good and what's bad. So if you have these interests I've been describing like I do, okay, you might run a business, you might teach entrepreneurship, you might get involved with technology licensing, which I also do, and you also might get involved with social entrepreneurship. And these are the 4 or 5 things that I'm mixing together today. And they're the kind of these are the 4 or 5 things I mix together every day in my life in Bangkok. So one of the things that I got involved with several years ago, and I think it's a great organization to be involved with, is something called the Global Social Venture Competition. It was originally started by UC Berkeley, and now it's kind of spreading around the world. And they try to promote which might be positive forces of change as we're talking about preserving culture or trying to prevent cultures from disappearing. So fair trade products have the promise to allow villages who are making craft products or locally produced products like herbal medicines and folk wisdom, try to preserve their way of life. There are projects that we've worked with for trying to protect indigenous people, trying to, and in fact, I was at Elon yesterday. We saw the presentation from Elon earlier today. These are great projects that are really trying to maintain a way of life, allow people to have a lifestyle that they can maintain in a economically sustainable way. So we wanted to have our own project. So we met this guy a few years ago who makes these solar-powered flashlights. This was at a GSVC event several years ago in the United States. And we thought this would be a great project to bring to Southeast Asia. And it would also give me a chance to go driving, which is exactly what I told you earlier I like to do. So we got all our students together in various universities, and we raised money and brought these solar lights in, and we deploy them around Southeast Asia. We put some in the Philippines and some along the border areas between Thailand and Myanmar. And this particular little story I'm going to tell you is about a trip we made recently to northern Laos. So we went all the way up to the northern border of Laos in a province called Phongsali, which is right up against the Chinese border. And it's a very, very rugged, mountainous area, very remote. People live in no access to electricity. And we're hoping that by giving these solar lights to them, they have a chance to study longer, to help them get a better education, work longer maybe to try to break the cycle of poverty, all of these kind of things. And the other interesting thing about this story is the people who live up here, I think they're on the next page. Oh, sorry. The people who live up there are all hill tribe minority groups. Hmong minority, Aka, these various groups that have maintained their fairly distinct cultures for a long time, largely by virtue of the fact that they've lived in a fairly remote area. In this particular area, their economic sustenance comes from these tea trees that are around 400 years growing in the area. They just harvest these trees, and that gives them enough sustenance to maintain their life. Well, we went up and visited these guys and gave them solar lights. So these are some kids from a very small village. This is in their Lao regulation national school uniform. This makes some people upset because they say, well, these kids should be preserving their cultural identity. And it's true, when you're in this area, you see a lot of people in what you would call traditional dress. Many of the people still wear traditional dress. But when they go to school, they're required to wear the national uniform. You see it in all schools throughout Laos. It also bothers many tourists to the area when they see kids wearing a Manchester United football shirt. Those are there too. You can see kids wearing what would be called Western clothes, and that really bothers people. And I'm bothered that people are bothered about this. Because why can't we let teenagers be teenagers, even if they're living in a hill tribe area? And that's going to be the main message that I'm exploring right here. So while we're driving up there, we spend a lot of time on little roads, and that's part of the fun. But we also see this kind of thing. That the previous picture and this picture are the same road, okay, a few hundred kilometers apart. But you can see the development is coming. And you can look at this from a lot of different perspectives. You can look at it from all the good perspectives, and you can undoubtedly look at it from a lot of bad perspectives. It's a very difficult challenge. How do you deny development? Or how do you keep a way of life and still have development? One of the things, if you look at a bigger view, and this, I'm getting this from an expert, this isn't from me, this is something I read, and I think it's attributed to another TED speaker. But the belief is, or the claim is made, that in the space of 2 generations, the world is losing half of its languages. 20 years ago or something, there were 6,000 languages in the world, and it's going to be cut in half in the space of 2 generations. Now, the reason this statistic is important is because it's hard to measure culture, but it's relatively easy to measure languages and people using languages. So this is kind of a quantitative measure of disappearing culture. And so I'm adopting language as the main unit for this short example that I'm going to give you over the next few minutes. So we're not going to talk about culture so much. We're going to focus right in on language and talk about how we preserve it or how we keep it from disappearing. So what is the right way? You know, I'm left with all these challenges of what is the right way, and you see these forces. These are the forces that kind of come into play. We heard about globalization a few minutes ago, development, technology, and technology today is being viewed as a positive force, this thing called the long tail. Now that we've got the internet, we can communicate free anywhere around the world, so people with a certain language, even if there's a small number of them, can preserve that language by talking back and forth. And I'm going to give you 2 examples of that happening. One is going to be with the people I just showed you in Laos, the Hmong people. But before I do that, I need to go back about 5 years to a trip I made to Palo Alto. I was in Palo Alto doing something with Stanford University, and I needed some money. If you're in Palo Alto, you use a lot of money. It's a very expensive place. So I went to this ATM machine. And the ATM machine took my card, and it said, choose your language. English, Spanish, and something else. Okay? And if I were in a different venue, we could have a whole discussion about English and Spanish, because there's people worried that English is disappearing in the US and being replaced by Spanish, which will soon be the most popular language in the United States. But we're going to talk about the third language here. I didn't know what this language was. I certainly didn't select it. I needed the money. But when I got back to the office, I looked it up. It turns out this language is Hmong, the same people that I was showing you a few minutes ago, people who lived in northern Laos. Now the question is, what is this doing on an ATM machine in California? Well, let's look a little bit at the history. The Hmong have been around, if you believe what I read, Wikipedia. We all read Wikipedia. The Hmong have been around for 4,000 years. They've been a very mobile people because they've always been moving away from civilizations that tried to ensnare them and assimilate them. So they arrived in Southeast Asia around the 19th century as they moved away from China, and they just kept moving further south. In the 1950s, a written language was developed for them by some Western missionaries. So for the first time, they had a written language, which was what showed up on the ATM machine. Now, of course, the other important point here is the Indochina War started around the 1950s into the 70s. The Hmong were on the side of the United States. The United States had a bad time in that war, and so a lot of the Hmong had to be repatriated or had to be moved out to the United States and other countries. And in fact, that's what we are, where we are today. And this slide right here represents the conflict that I don't understand. First of all, in Asia, especially southern China, Laos is a little bit behind, but they'll catch up. There are Hmong living in ecotourism locations and cultural parks where you're not allowed to wear a Manu shirt. You have to wear the traditional costume. You have to live like you are a traditional Hmong. Other Hmong are being forced to assimilate. In Laos, they're being forced to assimilate as part of the national culture. And there's these 120,000 Hmong living mostly in the US, in a couple of states, California, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and they are growing up as American teenagers, doing all the American teenage things, except traditional festivals are being kept alive, and the internet is keeping this link. So a lot of kids are chatting back and forth in Hmong on the internet and on different electronic devices. The question I can't figure out is, which is the best way to preserve a culture? There's good and bad in every one of these examples. That leads me to another example, which I also want to bring up as a parallel. Not Hmong, but Cherokee. Cherokee people are Native Americans in the United States, in North America, but in this case primarily Georgia, Alabama, and then they moved westward. And they are interesting for our discussion because it is the only group of Native Americans that had their written language. So they developed a written language, and you can see the script up here. And what's also kind of interesting for our story today is the person responsible for developing this language, a guy named Sequoia. His name would eventually become the name of a venture capital firm, but before that it was the name of a tree. But Sequoia was in the Cherokee tribe, and he was determined that for that culture to survive, it needed to have a written language. So he created this written language. Spent 12 years on the work. And it led to the development of the only Native American newspaper in its own language, the Cherokee Phoenix. Today, and again, I contrast this to Hmong, as we just saw a few minutes ago. The Hmong have 120,000 people living around the United States. 8,000 people remain who are literate in the Cherokee language, and most of them are over 50 years old. So this is a challenge. Is this a disappearing culture? Interestingly, December 2010, just last month, Apple announced that the Cherokee language would be the 51st language available on iPhone and eventually on the iPad. This is a very select list of languages. Cherokee is one of them. And the Cherokee Nation was very, very excited. They thought, okay, now our teenagers, just like the example I gave you before, our teenagers will work together, be able to communicate in Cherokee. They'll be able to use their BlackBerries and their iPods and everything in Cherokee. Well, this got me thinking. Here's what a teenager does with culture in English. I got these from my student, by the way. I don't know if these are correct. If they're not correct, you can't blame me because I don't know what they say. And even the rabbit here. Does this look like a rabbit to you? I'm told this looks like a rabbit. I got it in an email from one of my students. Happy New Year. Now, I think this is very clever. Just with very, very simple symbols, we're able to create a very colorful language. And I think it's also kind of interesting because I grew up in the 70s and 80s using machines that only had alphanumeric characters, and we thought we were so restricted. And then when graphics came along, it was the most incredible thing in the world. We've regressed, and yet the teenagers of today are able to create a much more colorful language than we ever had in the old ASCII system. So now let's take a look at what the Cherokee language looks like. See, this is what we can do with whatever, some numbers and some English letters. Here's what Cherokee looks like. 87 consonants. What is a Cherokee teenager going to be able to do with this wealth on a BlackBerry or an iPhone? And I'm saying this slightly humorously, but I actually believe there's a wealth of culture yet to be developed when somebody is on their BlackBerry. But I also ask the question, is that Cherokee culture? Or what will the Cherokee older generation think of this culture? Certainly there's a huge backlash about English for people who are writing in the previous slide. And I wonder how the Cherokee language is going to evolve once teenagers get a hold of it. So I leave you with one question, because this is the conflict I see. If we try to preserve culture, are we actually risking making it disappear? Are we actually relegating a culture to history? Because I think a culture is a living thing. It's not something that can be preserved and frozen in space. Thank you very much.